Thank you for watching, liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing right now. So I'm recording a Hangout by way of Google Plus here, and I'm joined by two people who have been a part of the communications industry for a long time, Jeff Pulver and Jonathan Taylor. Now, Jeff, you may have known from his 140 character conferences, specifically in relation to Twitter, 140 character, because he's a character himself, he's just one. But I don't know if you knew this. He had a series of events, Voice on the Net, in the Free World Dial-Up. He's co-founded so many of these things, or created so many of these things related to communications, including, and I don't know if you knew this, Vonage. I didn't know that about Jeff.
Hey, it's hard to show on Twitter all the things you do, so I say nothing.
That is certainly one way to go, is nothing, but you've certainly done nothing. And that was Jeff there. And this here is Jonathan Taylor, the chairman and CEO of Voxeo.
Hey.
And which is basically, it's a handful of different communications, solutions, or has continued to grow that way. And that's how you came upon my radar when I started working with Adam Calzi a few years ago. And if you didn't know, Voxeo has about, 200,000 developers that you work with your platform?
Yeah, just over 200,000 registered developers. I think it's pretty close to 220,000 now.
And the company is specifically focused on cloud-based communications.
Yeah, we sell private cloud, hosted cloud, and hybrid cloud, but at the end of the day, it's a platform to build communication apps in any of those models.
Okay. Well, now, Jeff, about a decade ago, you were hosting the Voice on the Net conferences, and I'm sure you got to see your share of tech startups and go, and see that firsthand. I mean, you pretty much drove it. Voice, real-time communications, etc. So what patterns did you pick up on back then, and what patterns do you see now in relation, Jeff?
Well, back then it was really more of playing a game of arbitrage in terms of getting access to long-distance rates and who had a better markets, better pricing and stuff. So it started out in 1998 where entrepreneurs bought these things called gateways, put them across the internet in different cities, and instead of paying for long-distance phone rates domestically or internationally, they basically bypassed all that and used the internet to do the handoff. That built a lot of businesses to this day, which still exist. The innovation was rare, but we saw a lot of replication. Billions of dollars was valued and recognized through the creation of what are called soft switches. These are switches. This is software basically that replaces the big iron that the phone companies had. I introduced a concept about 10 years ago called purple minutes because I was sick and tired of seeing so many black and white minutes happen. I was defining black and white minutes as the old minutes that we used to have, and then when the phone companies replaced their old technology with new technology, they were not doing anything intrinsically that was either never before practical or possible. And so I call those old black and white minutes. When I advocated for things like what Voxeo has been doing the whole time, which is using the platform to do things, to be creative, to basically extend the status quo beyond the mindset. But 10 years ago, it was really about cheap minutes. It was about being able to focus on what can be delivered and how. And over that time, we saw the evolution from the dial-up internet to the broadband internet. In 1998, I started the company, which became Vonage. Back then, it was a minutes exchange. I created markets to help facilitate the growth of the business. We helped produce events which focused on standards which were adopted, and we did legislation work which helped advocate a greenfield opportunity through public policy. And Vonage actually launched, I think, in March of 2002. And it's been a very interesting, Vonage turned out to be a good idea. Cable companies make billions of dollars from it every day. As far as where the rest of it goes, these days, starting about 2006, I started focusing on what I call socialcom, or social communications. This is before social media was big. Back then, social media, I started out 30-something years ago. My social network was ham radio. And my social network were the ham operators talking to each other. And that's how I communicated socially or otherwise for many years. And then email became my social network. And I will argue that, it's still a social net of sorts today, just not voice-based. When Twitter happened, I saw a lot of analogies, actually in my mind anyway. When tweets happen, I hear them in my head. I don't really read them. When I type as if I speak. And so for me, Twitter's been the radio experience since then. And so Starting in about 2006 at the Vine conferences, I started actually telling the phone companies, be careful of what's happening out there. The success of Facebook and then Twitter is going to change the way your customers behave, the way your customers communicate, and those behavioral changes are going to affect business forever, at least for how long forever is. And so, in fact, we're seeing that now. And so some of the innovations we're seeing right now, maybe in personal communications, but this is very much a very similar track to how voice communication evolved. And I just think that today we're sitting at a nexus point. Brands can no longer stand behind logos or press releases. There's a humanization that's happened. This humanization has then changed the course of how we do business and how we interact and how we connect. The back channel exists. For everybody who's on Twitter, who has a friend on Twitter they follow, who works for a major company, they now have a voice in that company, which may or may not be effective depending upon how active those companies are. So the whole customer relations management thing has changed. The whole spectrum for how we integrate and communicate is changing. Companies that are big enough to have a chief marketing officer had better think about hiring a CLO, a chief listening officer. And so the world really has changed. We are still people. We are still trying to connect, trying to engage in business. But the methods and means how we communicate is evolving and will continue to evolve.
Well, speaking of evolving, I guess Voxeo announced something today, Phono Mobile. Jonathan, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of what Voxeo has done in terms of our technology has lived in the cloud. It was all about creating communications platform infrastructure, make it super easy to build apps. Purple Minutes, as Jeff was talking about. My last company was a unified messaging startup back in the 90s, and we learned how incredibly difficult it was to create communication apps, especially if it incorporated voice. And coming out of that, we said, well, what if we make it a company that makes it easy for everybody else to create interesting kinds of applications? But before that, voice applications were sort of like a country club. It had like a limited exclusive membership, and the members sort of tried to keep everybody out without really saying they were trying to keep everybody out. And then we said, well, how do we bust into the country club and really start changing things up? And so we came up with this idea of making a hosted platform that was super easy to get started with, super easy technology, no barriers. You don't have to talk to a sales guy, you don't have to sign an NDA. Just sign up on the portal, what we call frictionless now. Start creating apps. Don't pay us anything, and when you're ready to deploy, then we can get you a production agreement in place, and you can pay as you actually build out a business. And that worked phenomenally well. Before we started, there's actually a book from back in that era, which were like 81 killer applications for computer telephony. That's what it was called, computer telephony. It was written by a friend of mine, Edwin Margulies, and like every application ever built was in this book, right? The 81 apps.
Yeah, like the yellow pages of the internet. Remember those?
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So we were like, well, how do we go from 81 apps to 8,000 applications or 80,000 applications? And we saw that over the 11 years since we started Voxeo. And about 2 years ago, we were looking at the client side of the market, and we realized that there was a similar sort of country club challenge on the client side. There's some great client software out there, like Skype, like what we're using now, but there's a relatively limited number of applications. And we said, how do we blow that up too? How do we disaggregate it? How do we make it so people can build 8,000 different kinds of audio and voice and desktop sharing client applications? And so we came up with this idea of creating an SDK which had all the little building blocks, the Lego parts, to build any kind of video conferencing, peer-to-peer audio application like what we're using here, but in a way that could be done for specific things. Like, we have a lot of customers in healthcare. What if our healthcare customers want to create a Skype-like service specifically for doctors and patients, and they have to pay attention to HIPAA and all the regulations, so they can't just use an off-the-shelf Skype client? How could we enable a company in the healthcare space to go build something like that? So that was the birth of Phono. And what Phono lets developers and really anybody do is create apps like what we're using here on Google Talk, create Hangouts, or create other interesting, innovative kind of applications, whether they're really specialized or other. But yeah, so we launched this Phono Mobile today. We had launched Phono on the desktop a couple months back. Makes it so you can do audio and instant messaging and soon video on any desktop browser, and then just came out with the Phono Mobile version, which makes it so the same apps can now run on any Android or iOS device.
Really?
And we're already seeing that. We've seen people use Phono to build everything from these next generation of customer relationship management apps Jeff was talking about, to building crisis response apps, where like, if there's a crisis, you can hit one button and it'll go out and call, 20, 30, or 100 people and put them all into a conference like this so that they can collaborate in a crisis environment.
Anyways,
lots of cool stuff. So Phono is actually meant to be this sort of an abstract API, and it's got a plugin architecture where you can plug in different things underneath it. The implementation today that we have built actually uses Jingle, the XMPP interface for voice. It's just what Google Voice uses, and we did that because XMPP in the browser is easy. There are all these technologies like Bosch, which does XMPP over HTTP. It makes it really easy to go through firewalls. So it's kind of like low-hanging fruit to have the XMPP plugin first. But ultimately, we're going to have plugins for XMPP. We're going to have plugins for SIP. There are these new standards coming in the browsers, RTC Web and WebRTC, where the browsers themselves are going to have API underpinnings to do voice and video. So we're also building plugins for WebRTC. But the long and short is that the Phono API is designed to run over anything. Today, it's running over XMPP.
So I'm definitely not a developer, but I certainly enjoy the things that developers create. Is this particular system designed more for developers or for people who are looking to build their own solutions who don't necessarily have direct access to a developer?
It's really both. It's developers directly. We call it a toolkit, a set of Lego building blocks. But we have such a big ecosystem, those 220,000 registered developers at Voxeo, that it's exceptionally easy for us when somebody comes to us and says, hey, I want to go create this solution, but I don't have developers. We've got this huge ecosystem of folks we can tap into, bring them in to help build applications like that.
Very nice. So a while ago, and I think it was VentureBeat that ended up quoting Dave McClure, who's an old friend of mine. I knew him since way back when he was working at PayPal. David said, open is for losers. So my question is, how important have open standards been in the evolution of this real-time communications industry, and how important will they continue to be?
Well, I'll start and tell you that open, it's interesting. Microsoft is always for open until they can dominate the marketplace, and they like to close things up. And that's been their history. I think Cisco hasn't found the protocol they don't like, but they like to promote the ones that are internal to them. And I think that from a business engineering, business development perspective, everybody wants to be open. I mean, let's face it, if it wasn't for HTTP specs 1.0, the World Wide Web probably would not have evolved, and the way we communicate would not be the way we are. Specifically, whether we're talking Jingle, SIP, H323, or for that matter, the RFCs that define email. I mean, there's a value to have an open understanding of the protocols we need to communicate. But as far as being disruptive, yeah, open is incredibly disruptive. It's sort of like free. How do you compete with free? How do you compete in a world where anyone and everyone that wants to can openly, freely communicate with everybody else? How do you communicate in a world where the world's going flat and the gatekeepers are going away? It disrupts everything we know. So a defensive strategy from an incumbent would want to go keep everything close to the chest because they don't want to share so much. But I think open standards is how we evolve. Back in the early days, it's a good thing the VCs were not involved with email because I could not really tell you what the business case for email was. But I can tell you, though, that the advent and evolution of email brought forth trillions of dollars of true value, which are being seen and experienced around the world today. In terms of open standards, I'm open. I'm fairly public about stuff, and I'd rather focus on things that are open and shared and closed and work with a collective consciousness than work by myself. Now, strategically, do we like to do things privately? Do we share everything? Probably not. I mean, just like I have private things, I don't share everything, but as far as getting consensus to move the world, I like open.
No,
I take the other side of that. I definitely like open.
What about you, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I think Dave, I think Dave likes to just say stuff to get people riled up.
Yeah,
so,
it's a bit bombastic.
I don't know if he honestly, personally believes in that one or not. I mean, there is something to be said. I kind of understand the sentiment of the statement. It is true in the B2C market when you're selling to consumers that often the leading vendors will be, more closed, more proprietary solutions. You look at Skype, for example, with closed architecture. But, when you're selling in a B2B environment, it's almost impossible to be really successful without open standards. You look at even the companies, as Jeff was saying, the size of Microsoft and the size of Cisco, have a lot of adoption of standards within their products. Their customers expect to see them. So, you can build products in the B2B space that are not standards focused, but they'll peak. They hit some point where you sell to everyone who doesn't care about standards. It's almost like that's a target market in B2B, those who don't care about standards. But at some scale, at some size, you're limiting your business if you're not standards focused. And I think we've seen that with Voxeo. That's been a big differentiator for Voxeo. We started, again, 11 years ago, we were as scrappy and underdog companies you can imagine being. And, now we're taking more and more business away from companies like Alcatel and Cisco and HP, really big vendors in this space. I think in large part because we don't pay lip service to the idea of standards. We really mean it. We drive the standards. We invest a lot of money in having our employees run standards like the Voice Working Group, the W3C. So, like Jeff, I'm also a big advocate of standards. I think that proprietary solutions have their place and can certainly win in places like the consumer industry, but in the business industry, it's a really hard strategy.
So
no, Chris, I would argue though that where standards get in the way sometimes is when you want to be truly innovative. So maybe Dave was really saying, okay, well, look at what Skype did or others did. And it's true to some extent. I've politically seen ways where old incumbents use certain standards to prevent innovation in a space. Of course, they would say, we must adhere to these standards that are 125 years old. And the idea of a new idea and a new way to reinvent things, forget about it, So I've seen that. And, we've seen the future. And it's standards from the 1890s. And we should apply those rules. Same thing with the way that lobbyists work. People love to, when an industry is being disrupted, they like nothing more other than to take the rules and regulations that were invented way before the idea was conceived and apply them now and say, gee, you shall not do that because it's illegal or because we never thought about that. And so, closed gives you a chance to walk into a room with no walls, no windows and start something fresh and think something new. But, that's where open came from too. Yeah. Open really is something that was once old and we made new. We refreshed the thought and we conceived of something and we shared it. So, if we take something that's closed and explode it to the world so billions of people can participate, I love it. Because I do think every once in a while we need to release our minds and rethink things. And so just because everything is being done a certain way for 100 years doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. It doesn't mean it's the way it has to be done. And so there is this part that says, let's throw that out and let's start fresh. So, standards are great if we are the good guys. But sometimes those good guys go to the other side, the dark side. And sometimes that dark side, they like using those standards. I'm still puzzled by the fact that apparently evil civilizations, I think for the movie, I'm trying to remember, the 4th of July movie that came out years ago, where Will Smith went in and he used TCP/IP or something to tell that into the alien spacecraft, It
was Jeff Goldblum. He used his Mac to interface with an alien system, right?
Right, but TCP/IP did it, So apparently we had standards, because if those standards weren't out there, we would be dead.
Right, right. So. I hear you. Well, it's interesting. You're talking about, and I think Jonathan, you even brought up Skype, and we're talking about open, closed standards, etc. Well, Skype, of course, was recently acquired by Microsoft. My question, and I'll ask you, Jonathan, first. That sounded odd. I don't know if that was an elephant in the room or someone vibrated there, but either way, Microsoft acquired Skype. So, Jonathan, do you think that this was a good or a bad thing in terms of the real-time communications industry?
I think it's going to be a good thing because Microsoft has a unique ability to get Skype built into the Windows operating system and to take it. I mean, Skype is enormous, but there's a lot of people that don't use Skype. And you think about how pervasive Windows is, and I think Microsoft has a great opportunity to make Skype even more pervasive by, building it into Windows, building it into their new generation of phones. Certainly, Microsoft, can do evil, but the interesting thing is if you look at Microsoft from a competitive standpoint, Microsoft is actually declining, and interestingly, in their decline, they have embraced less evilness. They have embraced a more open approach, arguably. Even more so than some of their competitors like Apple. So they could do bad. I think the net is likely going to be that it's going to be good because it's going to make it more pervasive and we'll see more users out there using Skype.
But Voxeo itself, you're on a pretty short list in terms of companies that enterprises turn to for these cloud-based solutions for real-time communications. How would, if someone were to see you just up front and they would compare you to Microsoft or Cisco, what keeps you standing apart from them?
Well, I think the biggest thing that keeps Voxeo standing apart is our service. I mean, we have great technology, and arguably have really driven a lot of the technology in the communications application industry for the last 11 years. But even more so than our technology, we are known in the industry and with our customers for our customer service. You know, I'm a zealot about customer service. I'm the kind of guy that, you know, like infamously bans vendors when they do things wrong. Like at one point, both UPS and FedEx were banned at Voxeo, and we couldn't actually like ship anything, you know,
Wow.
next day. But yeah, and so we've put a ton of effort into great customer service and support, and you know, our customers and our prospects tell us, like we had a big deal we did in the UK earlier this year, which I believe is going to be the largest deal in our industry this year. And you know, when we debriefed, we won this deal, and we were debriefing, we were saying, well, why did we win the deal? And they were saying, well, you know, we did this RFP, we had like 100 questions, and we'd send the 100 questions out to everybody, and you know, you would come back within like 2 weeks with 100 answers, and then the other guys came back in about 6 weeks with 100 more questions. They didn't actually answer anything. So I think the other thing is just that we can execute. We're nimble, we're aggressive. We've built the technology and the company and the process to scale. So again, I think the biggest thing is just execution, our ability to deliver, and our ability to provide this path from customers that starts with this startup and individual developers and goes all the way to the largest buyers, you know, these kinds of products and services in the industry.
Jeff, now I've only heard bits and pieces of something called the Pulver Order. Could you explain what this is and how it's keeping pace with this industry?
Sure. I mean, I could spend an entire hour telling you the entire story, but I'll give you the very brief part.
Thank you.
2004, and February 12th, I think it was February 12th, 2004, then Chairman of the FCC, Michael Powell, issued something called the Pulver Order. It made my name a subject down in Washington. Any telecom lawyer from then forward knows about it. Specifically, what it states is that voice communication that starts on the broadband internet that doesn't touch the legacy phone network and ends up on broadband is not to be regulated as telecom. It was the first positive ruling for voice over IP anywhere in the world. And if you were to ask Tim Draper about the Pulver Order, he'll tell you it was worth $500 million to him because that's how much he made on the sale of Skype. Because he shared with me when I went to pitch him in 2007, I was pitching him a startup, and he interrupted the meeting. He actually walked in on it. He wasn't actually being pitched. It was his other partners. But he made me tell the story of the Pulver Order to him and his partners. And when he left, he crushed my hand. My hand really hurt. And when I went back to the pitch to try to like go back and pitch them again, the partner stopped me and said, "Well, what did Tim do?" And I said, "What? He interrupted the meeting. He asked me to tell you the story of the Pulver Order. He crushed my hand, and I'm trying to pitch you now." No. Don't you understand that when you were out there trying to get this Pulver Order to happen, and you were spending 2003 and 2004 talking to all these regulators, the people on the Skype board were very, very worried because if the Pulver Order didn't go through, they'd be screwed. Oh. So him crushing your hand was symbolic of him thanking you for helping him make $500 million. I said, "Oh,
wow, interesting." Well, you know, hopefully, you know, we'll continue to see this. I've been having my own issues with broadband in my area. I mean, not specific to real-time communications, you know, specifically. Although I got to tell you, and this kind of parlays into my next question. I'm doing this by way, or we're doing this by way of a Google Hangout. I've been cautious about doing this because my bandwidth provider, Comcast, has a cap for residential services, and even working at home, you know, I'm cautious about how much data that I'm pushing down the pike. If only because video, pretty bandwidth intensive.
It is, and it'll get worse as the infrastructure is imbalanced. And one of our bigger issues we have to face in the next 3 to 5 years is going to be the separation of connectivity from content, and the idea that if we want to actually have a free ecosystem for us to invade and bring in innovation and bring in delight and joy to the way future generations are going to experience content, we're going to have to find ways to deal with the lobbyists and also deal with the phone companies which have cable infrastructure. And, you know, it was Comcast, I think, that originally was prioritizing packets of their own against Vonage, so that, you know, when certain voice services suffer, it's not typically the vendor, it's how the packets actually end up on the far end and how they get through to your home and your service that ultimately will affect them technically. But the consumer will think, okay, it's the Vonage isn't so good, or this isn't so good. When in reality, it's the local infrastructure that's prioritizing for their own benefit. So yeah, Comcast is going to have issues, but this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just America.
Sure.
But here in America, I do worry about the future of innovation when it comes to things like broadband-based services, because entrepreneurs do not have a greenfield opportunity if we're really fighting against the mean old bad guys who've put arguably hundreds of billions of dollars, call them trillions of dollars, in infrastructure and technology. It's not my fault, but I assume it's there. I like to be the parasite. I like to be the one who will ride over those rails and deliver innovative services that disrupt the core companies. But that's a different discussion. I'll tell you this: when freewheel dial-up happened, Voxeo was awesome for us because we were using them all the time as a development platform. We were encouraging our customers to use the Voxeo APIs to create cool new services, which we then tried out through the freewheel dial-up. So it was a wonderful test bed for innovation, and the folks at Voxeo were always kind to us. I actually invested in the first version of Voxeo, if you remember. Not the second, but I was there for the early days, and I have great belief in not only the vision but the people behind the products. And really, I think that to some extent, being ahead of yourself, you don't always get credit for the things you see or do. But these are guys that have been around a very long time, and I happen to be fans from afar. And I think together, the future for communications is being explored and tested and delivered. Today, and it really, it's these guys have seen the vision, seen the opportunities, and now providing cloud-based solutions that work, which is kind of cool in my book.
Okay, well, so to wrap it up, Jonathan, what do you think is coming up next? Trends in real-time communications, let's say over the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, I think one of the big things, as I was mentioning, is this RTC web and the WebRTC standards, where the underpinnings of voice and video are actually going to be built into all the browsers. In Phono today, I mean, doing calls from a web browser is not new. Jeff, I'm sure you remember Dialpad from, darn near...
Try Surf and Call, Vocaltech in 1998.
Yep.
I remember NetMeeting. I used to play with NetMeeting all the time.
NetMeeting, of course, NetMeeting.
Yeah. So, it's not new, but even back to the era of Dialpad, companies have had to, trick the browsers into doing it using Java applets, downloading plugins that often people can't take advantage of because of IT security concerns. So, having the underpinnings built into the browser is, again, going to make voice and video ubiquitous and make it so you can build thousands and thousands of different kinds of customized applications. So I think that's going to be a big thing. I think the other big thing is going to be, the advancement of wireless. My LTE wireless gizmo is faster than my home cable modem now.
Really? Oh, that's sad.
Yeah.
Wow.
I run a speed test on my cell phone and get about 30 megabits per second, and I run a speed test on my home cable modem, and I get about 20 megabits per second, right? So,
I'm jealous.
It's I mean, Jeff has been challenging these guys forever. Jeff, I always remember the story of how you pretty much forced the phone company to get
fiber. 1996, I got a fiber roll to my house.
Exactly. And, it's like you're forcing fiber back then, and now we got to try to force cable, bandwidth caps and everything else. So I think there's always going to be a fight between the forces of good and evil, and, fight between the incumbents and the outcomers. But I think in the next 10 years, you're going to see a lot of those walls continue to get torn down. I think it's inevitable.
I think it's slightly ironic, but true. Why is the dark side? Why is Darth Vader's voice owned by at one point Bell Atlantic? What are we saying? Hello, they are the dark side. They will forever be the dark side. They're evil.
Yeah.
So good stuff coming down.
I think that fight is going to continue to evolve. But...
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys, for joining me on this Friday morning.
Thanks. Nice to see you, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And enjoy the weather wherever we are.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's been great.
Sure. We're in three corners, aren't we?
New York City, it's 101 degrees outside, 115 heat index. It's hot.
Where's it at down there, Jonathan?
Yeah, and we're in Orlando, which actually it's a pretty nice day today. I was telling Jeff before, it's a rare day that the summer weather is arguably nicer in Orlando than it is in New York.
It's pretty, I'd say it's temperate today for Seattle in the summer. I think it's the first day of semi-sunshine we've had in like 7 months in the middle of July. Yeah, so. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Chris.